everybody. Welcome to the season two premiere of Healing with Nama. I'm Casey, and today I have a special guest with me, Dr. Kelly Vincent, somebody who was very pivotal in helping me in the beginning of my spiritual journey. She met me right when I was in the midst of having anxiety and panic attacks and depression and all that stuff. And she really helped me get to the place that I am today. So I always remember her and talk about her to other people because she really played a big part in me even being able to have a podcast because um, there's just no way that the person that I was when we met would have done this. So yeah, so it's just I'm just so excited. I've been planning it in my head for a really long time. So I'm happy that it came to fruition and we were able to make it happen. Even with all the crazy technology issues we've had this morning, I'm just really excited to have you here, and I'm so thankful that you said, that you would do it. So,
Yes, well, thank you for having me.
of
And
course.
yes, my heart is exploding right now. So I appreciate all those kind words.
Yes. And do you want to just maybe like share a little bit about you and what you do?
Definitely, yeah. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm actually based in Encinitas, California. If you have listeners that aren't in California, and predominantly I work with a lot of women. I didn't intend on specializing with women, but it just sort of naturally happened that way, and I absolutely love it. And I would say sort of the focus of my work is anxiety, trauma, self-esteem, transitions, life transitions, relational struggles, that type of thing. I often too use what I would consider a mind body approach in my work, really making sure that we're integrating the mind and the body, but then also kind of looking at each of my clients holistically and making sure that we're not just zoning in on just the cognitive piece, but also everything that's sort of somatically happening and sort of impact of that. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And I was so excited when I found you on Instagram. I just so happened to, I think you were on my explore page or something. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's Kelly. Like, look, she's doing amazing. She's got her own practice. And because when we met, you were interning, so you weren't Dr. Kelly Vincent yet. So I was so excited to see that you were doing such great things and to just reconnect with you because, like I said, you played a really huge role because that time in my life was the turning point for everything for me. So, the people that showed up for me during that time are really important to me, because, so many people had a hand in molding me in a way. um, yeah, I was having a really tough time. And so to have someone like you, I felt like, yes, you were there as a therapist, but I felt like you cared about me as a person. And so it just made all the difference in the world to be like, okay, yes, like somebody understands or is at least trying to understand what's happening because I don't even know what's going on. Um,
Yeah, that's hard, especially
yeah,
when we're feeling these feelings, and especially feelings that we may not have felt before, or maybe they're just more intense and they've manifested in different ways. It's so hard to unravel what's happening in our minds and our bodies. But yeah, to have, and I'm so glad that the space that was held for you was helpful and effective in a lot of ways. Because yes, I was an intern at the time, and I'm still learning. Actually, let's be real.
right.
I'll be learning forever. But yeah, I mean, I think just reaching out for support and getting that and sort of knowing that you're worth and you deserve that support in that space to be held,
Yes.
such a strength that you naturally had. Um,
Mhm.
it's so nice to just hear that that was, just sort of maybe a foundational piece as it relates to sort of what you're doing now, which really is.
Right.
So glad you found me on the good old Instagram. I mean,
Yeah.
that world is wild, but these types of connections make it so worth it.
Yeah, I think that, it was purposeful, I think it was meant to be that I was able to find you and reconnect so that this could happen. And so that I could thank you personally, because I never got a chance to say thank you because, it's a therapist thing, you move on. It's not like a friendship or anything. So I always am like, I just want to tell her thank you so much for helping me. So I'm glad that I get to say that to you.
Oh, I so appreciate that. And I probably said this to you years back, but you did all the work.
Yes. So I just wanted to kind of jump in and talk about anxiety,
Sure.
depression, and imposter syndrome because I know that you do speak a lot about that. And those are things that I have definitely experienced even recently with doing the podcast and with, really building up my brand as a spiritual influencer. I've been really suffering from that. So I wanted to see if maybe we could start with imposter syndrome and maybe just explaining what that is.
Yes, yes, and it's such a it's definitely not an enjoyable experience, but it's a very common,
Hmm.
very common experience that I think most people don't realize that others, go through it as well. We often tend to think it's all us or we're alone in it. But essentially, imposter syndrome, the way to kind of describe it is that it's a struggle to internalize your own success. It's a struggle. Essentially, it's an anxious experience or an anxiety experience where our worth is questioned. We doubt ourselves. Maybe other people view us as really successful and doing all the things, but us we start to just we don't feel that way.
Right.
With every reason as to why that's not the case, and so we feel ultimately like a fraud, right? So if we're putting ourselves out there in new ways, right? Starting a podcast is a good
Hmm.
example, starting a private practice, whatever it may be, we're going into this new space and being like, oh my gosh, they're going to find out. They're going to find out that I totally am a fraud. I don't know what I'm doing.
Hmm.
And it's going to be awful. But in reality, we all feel a little fraudulent at times, and especially when we're doing something new. So it can be so common. Also, I think with women in general, it can be very common just for a variety of reasons as it relates to like society, historically, things like that. So yeah, you're not alone, and it's hard because sometimes it can limit us and not allow our potential to be seen for exactly what it is because we just in our minds think that we're not good enough or we don't have the skill set or whatever it may be. But in reality, you definitely do. It's just human to feel a little fish out of water.
Right. Yeah. And I think that just perfectly explains it. Where I was when we met, and also now being that I am trying new things. So I'm more confident, but I'm confident in the things that I've already been doing. So when I try something new, I'm just kind of like, I don't know enough about spirituality to teach people. I haven't been in this long enough to help people. Who am I to share my experience when I'm not certified in this or that? I don't have my master's degree or anything, and it's just kind of like I know that I'm meant to help people, but sometimes you get caught up in the labels and having this degree or that title, and it's just kind of like I know that I am useful and beneficial just based on my experiences, and so having confidence that I know what I'm talking about um, is where I am now. Just building it up, keep pushing through the fear, um,
Right.
so that the fear doesn't stop me or talk me out of doing things that could really be helpful for other people.
Oh, exactly. And know too that like every sort of step and every sort of expansion of your knowledge and your experience, right? Like there's always going to be that next thing that you feel a little like, can I do this, right? Like
Right,
when I'm coming on other people's podcasts, I'm like, who am I? I don't know. I mean, I've only been doing this for how many years? Like I'm not like ridiculously seasoned. Like who am I to say, right? But there is my knowledge is my own unique spin, and yes, I
right,
may not I never will know everything, but my what I do know, I can share, right? So it's the more you give yourself that grace and that self compassion, that you have a lot to offer, and then there's more that yes you can learn that you will eventually offer as well. So I always like to think of it as like each step, right, step by step versus this I have to know everything. And I will self disclose, I got caught up in that as it relates to the degrees and the certifications. I was like, okay, if I get all these things, then I'll feel
right.
or
Yeah,
and yeah, they obviously help because it provides more education, this and that, but they're not necessary,
right.
right? You still can offer so much wisdom and insight and support and space for people without all of that jazz. So yeah, so know that I've been there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's, like you said, it's very common. But when you're going through something, you often feel like you're the only one. Even if you know, like, cognitively, or, like, there's probably other people, but, like, right now, no, it's just me. Like, I'm losing my mind, like, that's how I felt, when I started coming to see you, because I was just in a place of, like, being hit with this anxiety. And now I'm like, I'm losing my mind. Like that's the end. I need to check into a mental hospital because I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to respond to this because it just hit me all of a sudden. So now that I know what it is, trying to just work through that part and trying to teach people, um, it's my calling. And so working through that imposter syndrome is just reminding myself of, hey, you were in this place. Remember when you felt, these feelings and you figured out what was happening for you. There may be somebody who's feeling the same way, and if you don't share, then you're kind of and being selfish in a way, because somebody needs to hear what you have to say.
100%.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Excellent.
So, how did you even get into this line of work? Like, how did you even end up being Dr. Kelly Vincent?
Yeah, good question. And so, speaking of imposter syndrome, so this will kind of tie it all in. So, I actually went to school for business.
Oh, wow.
I went to San Diego State, got my degree in business marketing, and I was actually in digital marketing. I for 6 years. So working for like, for instance, I had one of my first jobs out of college was working at this digital agency where I worked for Rubio's. So you know the
Oh,
Mexican restaurant. I
wow.
with their website and different sort of social media social media was super new back then, but like social media campaigns, things like that. And then around 25-ish, I had what I call a quarter life crisis. And I thought to myself, A, what am I doing with myself? B, this is not fulfilling. There's something missing. And hearing people's stories and understanding people, understanding how people think, like that always fascinated me. I think a lot of people are fascinated by it because it is interesting. And this idea of, being potentially a pivotal piece in someone's story or journey was just something that I'm like, that feels like that would be really fulfilling. Feels like that would be really interesting. So I essentially just did a 180 leap of absolute faith and explored. I explored for about a year, right? So I went to my own therapist. I volunteered. I assessed it, but still I kind of leaped of faith, applied to graduate school, and just like went for it. Um, and decided, okay, I'm going to be a clinical psychologist. I think this is the right thing. I have no idea if it's the right thing. So, talk about imposter syndrome. I came into that, I remember so pivotally, that very first day of grad school, that very first class, and I was like, what the F am I doing here?
Yeah.
What, who am I? Like, this is ridiculous. I know nothing about psychology. I'm a business major, right? So, I had all these imposter syndrome experiences. And I would say that lasted pretty much all of grad school.
Mm,
All of grad school, and I had a pivotal professor who helped me see, like, no, 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 like, even though your experience is vastly different, it still will serve you, which come full circle with the whole like marketing your practice and all that. It does, or it did. But I had to work through that each and every year, and I had, yeah, a lot of anxiety during those years, a lot of the imposter syndrome, but I couldn't name it then. I didn't really know what that was at that point. But nonetheless, I knew that I wanted to help people, and I knew that I wanted to do it in a way kind of on my own terms, in the sense of creating something that kind of came from my mind and my passions. So private practice was always something that I was interested even before I started grad school, like that idea of kind of creating your own business because I had
mm,
that business background, so that was alluring. But then being able to help serve people in the ways that made the most sense to me versus maybe at an agency or at a college campus or something like that.
right.
So I had that goal when I went in, and then essentially once I got licensed, I just again went for it. Talk about another round of imposter syndrome, like who are you? You
Yeah.
just started. What are you thinking? That kind of thing. And then essentially since then, it's kind of evolved from there. And then sort of the next iteration of where I'm at is starting now a group practice.
Oh,
So
wow.
other clinicians. I'm a big believer in kind of that, again, I think I said this, mind body piece and the holistic piece, making sure people are supported in ways that they need to be supported based on who they are, their backgrounds, all the things. So I guess the whole kind of roundabout way of saying is I didn't necessarily intend on where I'm at professionally. It just sort of, yes, a lot of hard work, but then also it just kind of, my heart just kind of like led me in that direction.
Right.
Um, yeah, and most of the time I did not know what I was doing at all. I just kind of, threw up the Hail Mary and tried to see where it would land.
Right.
But very grateful and very thankful and appreciative of where I am at and all of the experiences that I had during grad school, the practicum sites, the internship,
Mm.
all that kind of thing has helped also shape sort of what I'm interested in, what makes sense to me, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was just again kind of one step at a time, where it created where I'm at now.
Wow. That's so interesting that you didn't intend to do this, but you were just kind of interested and you followed that interest and now it's like a full-blown thing. And I think that's how a lot of things happen. I know that kind of happens for me too, like being a Reiki practitioner and stuff. I just was like, "Ooh, that looks interesting." I like working with people. I like healing or, healing. And so let me follow that path, and it led me here and it led me there. And it's just kind of like when you follow those passions or you just follow your heart, it can lead you where you're meant to be. So I think that's really important to just let people know you don't always have to have it figured out. Because I think that we
No.
all think that you have to have it figured out. I have to know, like, if I decided to do this, then I have to follow through. And it's just like, no,
Yep.
no.
No, and even the people that do think they have it figured out, like say in college, right? And I remember meeting with a lot of my clients during that time when I was working at the college campuses, where like some did, and then they realized, oh, this is what I want, right? So like my younger self would have thought I had it figured out, and then 5+ years later, it was like, nope, right? So there's always that space, to kind of create some flexibility, because we change as humans, we grow, we evolve, we meet people, they help set us in different directions, right? So I think it's about being really open with ourselves and compassionate with ourselves when we're trying to kind of explore these journeys and these processes, because it's not linear. Just
No,
like struggles, it's not linear. We go up and down and around and sideways. And that can just be part of being a human. And usually when we look back, we're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But in the moment, in the thick of it, it can be really hard.
yeah,
It often kind of part of that process.
yeah,
Um, Pros and cons to that. Pros and cons.
right. Yeah, I think that's also lends itself to the therapy process, It's not linear. Because one day, you're in talking about this one thing, and then, you leave off, and then the next session, you're like, okay, we're going to start talking about this. But between that, if you have a week session or 2 weeks, something totally different happens, and you respond to it this way, and then we're like, okay, why did we respond? It's just all over the place. And I think that's what I try to get, like, my family and different people to understand is like, you're never for me, I feel like you're never gonna not need therapy. Like it's always gonna be something. It's gonna take a long time, especially the older you are. It's gonna take a really long time to talk about everything that you need to talk about because every session is gonna be different, you know. So I think just being open and not being like, oh shit, like I need to talk about this same thing that I was talking about last week. Is like, no, what's bothering you this time? So
So
yeah,
yeah, and different things happen too, right? Like it happens throughout your weeks, throughout years. And so yeah, I would agree with you that we could all use therapy throughout our entire lives, maybe not all of the time, but like again, those ebbs and flows of that support is often really helpful.
yeah, yeah. So, how do you think imposter syndrome like affects people? So, what do you typically see, or like, is it mostly women? Is it mostly men? Is there a certain age group? Like, where do you usually see that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I see it across genders. I mean, I predominantly work with a lot of women. The research, so imposter syndrome was originally kind of coined, by two therapists, Clance and Imes. I forget their first names, but they were doing these kind. I think they were. I don't know if they were workshops, but essentially they had they were working with a ton of women, very high being, go-getter, ambitious women, and they were starting to see this commonality amongst all the women, that these imposter-related feelings were showing up. And it was starting to become kind of a bit of a like, oh wow, like there's something here. Um, there's also this other piece of research that says, I think it's forget the person, the researcher that did it, but like at least 70% of the population will feel like an imposter at some point in their life. So again, just that idea of like so many. So yeah, so I see a lot with women. Again, I see a lot of women, but it does not sort of, it can span across genders, across ethnicities. Anyone can feel that way. And one important piece to actually add there is also when it comes to race, that can be something that can even more so become an experience, because for instance, if we're in a setting where it's predominantly white people and we're not white, we can innately feel the sense of imposter and a sense of difference because of that, especially if they're like microaggressions or any sort of discriminatory type of attitudes or things like that, that can enhance the experience for different reasons, right? So, and also depending on your history. Again, it doesn't, anybody can kind of experience it at any time. And
Yeah.
again, like I said in the beginning, I think when we start something new, we put ourselves out there in a vulnerable way, it can tend to start to show up. And so often how it manifests or what I see is just really like low self esteem around it,
Mm-hmm.
sort of not kind of going after our goals or the things that we're really passionate about because of the fear, a lot of anxiety, obviously, so a lot of rumination, a lot of overthinking. Also, I mean, I'll speak from my own experience. I remember every time I was doing something new, my whole body would just rev up. So essentially, that sympathetic nervous energy started to go. I got in fight flight mode. Digestive issues can happen. A sense of like pure panic. So it's that combination of just feeling like a fraud, feeling like we don't belong and we shouldn't be here. Someone can do it better, and then the anxious experience too. So right, like the body tension, the fatigue, the kind of stumbling on your words, right? There's just this inability to just feel really grounded and stable is often how it comes up. And a lot of people come to me when they're wanting to venture into something new, and they're just feeling so they're feeling so just limited because of it.
Yeah.
That's when I tend to see it a lot.
Yeah. Okay. And that kind of leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is like anxiety. So that, can happen with imposter syndrome or without it. So I guess, how does anxiety show up? You touched on it a little bit. What does it look like? How would somebody know if they're like me and it just all of a sudden happens? How would they be like able to say, okay, this is anxiety?
Yeah. So the one thing to kind of consider too is with imposter. I kind of consider, this is my own conceptualization of it, but imposter syndrome is just sort of another way to describe an anxious experience, right? So they're not the same, but they're like cousins.
Right. Okay.
Related. I think with imposter syndrome, anxiety tends to most likely be there most of the time, but yeah, not always. So with anxiety, it's one of those things too where anxiety is part of our biologically wired stress response, right? So when our brain perceives any sort of real threat or perceived threat, it's going to activate that sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, that fight, flight in us to essentially mobilize. So if a lion's chasing us, we better get out of dodge. Our
Right.
bodies get out of dodge. But it even an emotional threat. So this idea of like, we'll just use, starting a podcast. You're venturing into the podcast world, and then all these thoughts are coming up. Like, I can't do this. Do it better. That's going to activate your nervous system. That brain will perceive that it's a threat, even though it's an emotional threat and a perceived threat. It still responds the exact same way. So what can happen is this natural stress response that we need, right? We don't want to get away with it. We don't want to get rid of it because it helps us keep alert,
Mhm.
aware, thing, it can then turn into anxiety. So anxiety is more the experience of constant worry, inability to rest, inability to kind of recalibrate, the constant thought spirals, physical, chest tightening, feeling achy because we're constantly like, with our shoulders up to our ears, stomach issues, digestive issues, and then to kind of sort of that next level, kind of the stress. Normal stress is part of life, and then it's that anxiety, and then the next piece would be an anxiety disorder. And there's
Okay.
very specific criteria that one needs to meet in order to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And often, one of the pivotal pieces of diagnosing an anxiety disorder is if it's impairing your ability to function,
Right.
really getting in the way of work, personal, relational, that kind of thing. And then there's specific, time frame you have to be, whatever. But nonetheless, I think everybody knows what it's like to experience stress. And I think for the most part, a lot of people know what it's like to experience that anxiety. So that enhanced sense of worry, that enhanced sense of something bad's going to happen. And then there's a group of people that it then turns into a more habitual kind of, more days than not, they're feeling that way. So that's kind of how I sort of separate out all three, because they're all very similar.
Yeah, yeah. And that makes total sense. I think for most of my life, even now, I've been in some form of anxiety. It's just gotten better to the point where it's not debilitating, and I don't really suffer from social anxiety as much anymore. I'm able to just, go meet new people without thinking about it. But that anxious piece is something I still have to work on even now because it just feels like it's just a part of me. It's just innate for me to be worried and be stressed. And even at one point, I know you don't know, but I had to have brain surgery because I had a tumor on my brain on my pituitary gland. And I was reading that Cushing's can be brought on by stress. Now, I don't know that to be true, but I'm like, it would make sense because I feel like I've been a ball of stress my whole life. So, um, leading up to finding out that I had, like a tumor on my pituitary gland was just kind of like, okay, I can't afford to stress anymore. Now it's physically, I have digestive issues and stuff, but now it's physically um, manifested itself. And that's kind of how I force myself to look at it, even though that may not be true. It's just kind of like, okay, remember, you cannot do this to your body again. You have to stay calm. You cannot, you can't let yourself get to that point again. So I think it's just important to realize that anxiety is not only like mental, it can turn physical. Not saying you're going to get a brain tumor, but physical, there's physical symptoms, just being mindful. It's so important to keep yourself as regulated as possible. If it's possible, some people just live in situations where it's really hard to regulate your system. Some people don't have the luxury of living a calm life. But if you do have those, options, it's important to explore that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, first, I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah.
And second, you're absolutely spot on. The physical manifestations are more than we realize, and we hear doctors say, "Oh, it's just stress, just calm down or whatever." And I mean that couldn't. It's an understatement, right? I think we all live in this very hyper. I mean, think about the state of the world right now, right? Like, and the state of the world for the last how many years? There's just a lot of stress to be managed, and we often don't get taught the way to manage it, right?
Right.
Like we also have to consider we're working from a bit of a skill deficit, not because we're not smart enough to figure it out. It's just
Mhm.
because we haven't been shown potentially how to do that,
Exactly.
how to regulate our nervous systems, how to regulate when stressful times come. And you're right, as it relates to the privilege of being able to have that space and that calmness. I mean, there's plenty of people that are constantly like living through intense traumas of different kinds or a history of trauma that it's very hard to do that. And I think sometimes when I have clients where it's not as accessible, something as sort of small as kind of like a coping skill as it relates to something a little bit more tangible is like your breath,
Right.
right? Like can have great sort of control over your nervous system. And if we learn how to kind of regulate the nervous system through our breath, so deep, deep inhales, deep exhales, really filling the belly, expanding the lungs, right? Like really allowing space for some of those deeper breaths, that can be something to utilize. If you don't have, of course, the luxury or the privilege to do some of these other things, like there's all kinds of things. We could do a whole podcast on coping.
Right.
It's I think the two pieces are being aware of your system and what's happening in your body, in your mind, and really understanding your experience. And then the second piece is figuring out what coping works for you, right?
Right.
So anxiety, like you said, I actually just posted about this on Instagram today, where anxiety goes up and down. Sometimes we feel up and we're like, I got this. My coping is working. This is great. And then boom, the next week something hits us and it's the stressor is a bit more intense, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I can't do this, right? So it's natural for it to ebb and flow, and the more we widen that, what they call the window of tolerance, and there's a lot of ways to do that. One would be coping skills like breathing. The more we can kind of manage when those stressors come, because let's be real, this life is going to continue to throw curveballs right
Yeah.
at that we're going to have to dodge and try to kind of manage. So again, I wish all of this was taught, when we were like kindergarten through
Right.
high school. because we'd all be well equipped as it relates to mental health. But I think it's getting better. We're getting in that direction. But yes, so giving yourself a lot of grace and a lot of compassion
Right.
when it comes to this is new, right? This is new for a lot of people, and it's just a skill, like anything else, is a skill to build.
Right. That's so true. And so, leading into talking about depression, because for me, I don't know which one came first. I think it was the anxiety that hit first, and it led me to depression. I really can't tell you. They were just hitting, I was having panic attacks, anxiety attacks, depression. Like, and at one point, I literally remember sitting in my recliner at home, feeling like a shell of myself, in a fog, and I was just kind of like, I guess this is just how it's gonna be. Like I'm just gonna get used to feeling like I'm living in a cloud everywhere that I go. I just kind of gave in to the depression and the anxiety, and then with working with you more, then I was just kind of like, okay, well maybe I don't have to stay here. So can you talk a little bit more about like how those intertwine, maybe?
Yes, and again, you're spot on. They do intertwine. Very. If you think about anxiety, so say the anxiety came first, and who knows, but anxiety can cause a lot of irritability, right? Because again, your system is stuck on often. It's stuck in that fight flight mode. It's just go, go, go. No rest is happening. So that can make us start to be irritable, and it can start to impact our mood, which then kind of impacts with depression. It's a really mood based struggle, right? We feel this sense of like out of body sometimes, disconnection,
Right.
lethargic, motivated. It affects sort of just our daily routine. We lose interest in things, right? So, say anxiety did come first, that would make a lot of sense because if you're living in this higher state, it's like the body's just depleting, depleting, depleting. And then that insert hello, like we don't feel ourselves, so we start to feel sad and hopeless, right? So those two are very intertwined, and depression can be kind of the initial onset, or anxiety kind of, it doesn't really matter. It just more matters that it's you're human, and it's not abnormal, right? You're not abnormal. You're a human that's experiencing depression and anxiety versus you are depression and anxiety, and that's
Yes.
a big separation that I love to separate with clients, because sometimes we get then in our heads that like, oh, this is just me, like he's
Right. Yeah.
who I am. When in reality, it's not who you are. It's not your identity. It's what you're experiencing, what your identity is experiencing at that time for a lot of reasons,
Right.
right? A lot of historical reasons, maybe traumas, maybe setbacks, whatever, disappointments. And again, that's very normal and very human to have to go through those things. But it's hard, and getting support and figuring out what works for you, and what's helpful is so key, to kind of help move out of those states.
Yeah, and I'm so thankful that I was able to get free sessions at my school during that time because it would have been difficult to work through if I had to pay all these copays like other people. So when you're dealing with feeling depressed and sad and having those just unmotivated symptoms, it can be a challenge to one, reach out for help, and then sometimes it's hard to access it. So, what are some just at home like things that people can do if they don't have the access to mental health care?
Yeah. And that's huge, right? Like having accessibility, that's one big piece of the mental health. I mean, I can go on another podcast about that. Frustrations, with healthcare and all that. But I think when it comes to, if that's something you're interested in, you're recognizing that it's a struggle for you and you want to kind of move to a place of healing and relief. I think, again, that idea of just getting to know yourself, getting to know what's going on in your mind and your body. I always tell clients to kind of keep maybe in the note section of their phone, or maybe a journal, to really like when you do feel triggered, what's happening, like either what's going through your mind, writing down the cognitive thoughts that are happening,
Right.
also taking kind of somatic inventory. I feel it in my chest. I feel it in my belly. I feel just the sense of disconnection. Really trying to understand your experience. That I think is key. Another piece would be then like journaling about it. I know some people like they give me a hard eye roll with journaling, but it can be a very, very amazing way to externalize, especially if we don't have a lot of safe support to externalize verbally. Journaling can kind of be a way to work through that and unwind it all.
Hmm.
Piece would be support, would be connecting with someone that you feel safe with, someone you feel is trusting, a family member, a friend, that kind of thing, to kind of explain your experience, or not explain, but like just have your experience be heard, be
Mm.
seen. that can be very soothing. When it comes to coping, specific coping, I think yes, breathing can be really, really helpful. I don't tend to encourage people to go on Instagram because that's a whole nother list of potential
Yeah.
there are a lot of therapists that it's now a norm that are on Instagram providing um, free psychoeducation around all these things. I would caution to just kind of take a look at who's talking, like
Right.
where are they coming from, what
Mm.
their background, that kind of thing, just to make sure that what they're saying is based in either research or science or just whatnot. But nonetheless, just a little disclaimer. But there's so much great content out there as it relates to educating individuals about what depression, anxiety, like what is happening. So I think just again building up your understanding of it can be really helpful. I always say too, coping, moving your body, and I'm not talking about like, oh, go to like a huge hit, a hit class like every day. No, you could, but moving your body very intuitively, moving your body in a way that feels good, it feels relaxing. So maybe it's a gentle walk, or maybe it's a gentle stretch inside your home, or maybe it's a yoga class or a hit class or something like that. When we move our body, we can kind of move that energy that's being kind of stored as it relates to what depression and anxiety can kind of do internally. Sometimes that's a nice way to get some of that excess intense energy out. So yeah, so connection, moving your body, externalizing through journaling or talking with someone. Those are tend to be ways if you don't have the accessibility of a therapist to work one on one, be helpful
Yeah.
for sure. Just to
Yeah.
name a little bit of a few, because there's tons. There's tons.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we could probably have you on the show again to talk about, a little bit more, expand on it.
Yeah.
So I probably will reach out to you again in the future and see if you'd be interested in doing another show to just kind of talk more. I feel like we can expand in different ways on the same topic, and I feel like so many people are experiencing this that it would be really helpful to just have, even if it's just to know that you're not alone. So, people are talking about it and we're talking about our own experiences, to just know that you are not alone if you're feeling this way. You can reach out for help, or just feeling like you're not alone is really important to me.
Oh, I mean, it could not be more true because you're not like at all. I think most of us, and I haven't talked to every human on the planet, but most of us have felt like this at one time or another for one reason or another. It's such a part of the human experience, and again, it's just more about the awareness of it, and then gaining some insight as to what helps you. What works for you, if you will, and something might work for you now that may not later, and that's okay too, right? So it's an evolution of kind of building out that toolkit or those skills to be able to manage it
Yeah,
in a more way.
that's perfect. So, thank you so much for talking with me. I know we need to wrap it up, but where can people connect with you or find you? Do you have anything going on? Like, do you want to just share?
Yeah, so my website, drkellyvincent.com. There's more information about me and my practice, also on Instagram. My handle is Dr. Kelly Vincent. And I actually have a handful of free resources on both anxiety and imposter
Oh,
syndrome.
perfect.
They're downloadable like PDFs that kind of help sort of just give more insight into those two experiences, all free, and it's in the bio, right? So when you go on Instagram, there's a little bio, there's a little link. So you can kind of get if this is all new to you, but you're like, oh my gosh, this so resonates. That might be a good place to start. So yeah,
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy that you were on the show. You agreed to do the show, and I'm happy to have reconnected with you and just being able to talk to you face to face again. And thank you. And yeah, and just sharing your experience and your light with me. I'm just really grateful. So thank you.
thank you for having me, and I so appreciate that. And I'm so glad you
Yeah.
talked.
Well, you have an amazing rest of your day. I'm so thankful, and I will be reaching out to you in a little bit so we can maybe do this again if you're willing. Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you. Bye.